Greetings, everyone. I am an ex-air winger from the Marine Corps, and I was a 6238. That was my MOS. I worked on the radar and missile system for the F4-J, Phantom F4-J. This film we are about to watch was made in about 1967. I saw the film as part of a training course in 1969. I had to watch this film in a 6-week course in El Toro, California. 8 hours a day for 6 weeks. And I worked on this airplane for about 2 years. My first year and a half, 2 years of training, and I don't know why, I've got the sound turned off. So with the sound turned off, we're going to go through this. The F4 was the F-35 for its time. It was state-of-the-art. There I am. These are Navy personnel, but that was me. Every night for about 2 years, 2.5 years straight, I worked on this radar system. I knew it intimately. Where that guy is sitting up there, that guy, that's where I spent most of my time for the last 2 years I was in the Marine Corps. Was in the back seat. I was either in the back seat or on the ground, and this was state-of-the-art. The first F4s, the F4Bs, they had a radar, but it wasn't a pulse Doppler. What they're explaining to you now is the pulse Doppler, this new radar that replaced the F4B. The F4B radar was good for sidewinders and had limited ability with sparrows. But the F4J could see an aircraft below them. Because of the pulse Doppler effect in the new system, they reduced ground clutter. With the old system, if a plane was below you near the ground, and you got a lot of ground clutter and you couldn't see the plane for the ground it was flying over. And this film was taken and made for training purposes by the Navy. I'll make 2 videos. This one is, I'm trying to explain that I had to understand all this geometry. I was tested on what I saw here. And what they're explaining is this radar, this AUG-10 radar, did everything. It had air to ground. It had air to air. It had search, ground search. It had even terrain clearance, where if a person was qualified, they could fly it close to the ground and just follow the scope. And you'll avoid all the mountains and the valley, and you'll be in the valleys. But this plane was manufactured in St. Louis. Here's one with a lead in it. That's a lead plug to make up for the radar that isn't there. That radar right there is state of the art. Now, this was a telemetry pod, probably IBM equipment, the old stuff, the old tapes and reels of recording. This was 1967 when these tests were run. And these tests were run in Point Mugu, California. El Toro, where I was stationed, was just up the road, or down the road from Point Mugu. And right there, that's a Sidewinder missile. And the reason I had, okay, launch flight. They were testing all these missile shoots from different angles, shooting down, shooting up, shooting closing, shooting away. All the geometry was done. Here they're putting it over a pit. There was pyrotechnics that ejected the missile. It was like a shotgun shell. That missile, what they're going to do now is they're going to test that the missile deploys. It's a deploy. They hit the button, fire. Now the shotgun shell, the saddle pushes it down. And there's a lanyard on the missile that when the lanyard reaches the end and it's no longer hooked up. Now here's what I did for a living for 2.5 years. Okay, we're into a commercial. I got to skip this, get out of it. We're going to run into this. Skip ad. Skip ad. What happened? There it is. All right, we're back. We might have to go through this, be interrupted by these commercials, but that's where I lived for 2.5 years, either in the back seat or on the ground replacing components. And I want to let you know, whenever we had to replace a component that had a lot of screws, like the turtleback, there was 3 computers behind the second cockpit, the RIO's position. In that turtleback, there was probably 40 screws that had to come out of that turtleback to get access to the 3 computers, flight computers. And we did everything with a speed handle. There was no such thing as electric drills back there. Electric powered drills, we didn't have them. When you had to take by yourself, replace a computer, the box said the computer in the turtleback was bad, and there was just you spent 45 minutes with a speed handle opening up that turtleback. You didn't have any power equipment to do it. Everything was hand. But what they're showing here, you see where the guy is tapping that fin in the place with a mallet? They found out that there was a lot of failures with the way the missile was being handled. I mean, they had to hang it first before they put the final fin on. When they put the fin on, they tapped it in with a mallet. Sometimes you destroyed the missile or made it fly wrong. This was a Navy airplane, so the wings folded. Here they put it in a laboratory for a raining. They soaked it with rain for about 24 hours at a high temperature to see where it was going to leak, where it was going to fail. This all happened during testing. Now the rain is over, they pull out the unit and they're testing it for leaks, for any damage. And I want to let you know, where you see all these ladders going up to the airplane and up to the cockpit. The Marine Corps never had a ladder. Every time a pilot or a mechanic made a trip up to the cockpit, it was the inboard ladder. You pushed the button, this little thing dropped out, and you had to climb up like a monkey. You never had those ladders. We didn't have them, and the Navy had very few. But here they're hanging a Sidewinder, and the reason it's a Sidewinder, it has a lens on the front of it. That has a lens on the front of it that seeks heat. Okay, it can seek and see heat, and it follows that heat. Now this is a Sparrow missile on a wing pod. They're handing a Sparrow on a wing pod, and like you see where he's tapping it in there, they found out there was a lot of failures if some people were a little aggressive tapping that fin in. Okay? Now, this is all done during that test, and how crews are going to react. These are, right now, they're prototyping every event. This is a brand new airplane. These are testing new. It's not out in the fleet yet. Okay? So everything is prototyped. They're proofing every procedure. You got engineers there. This guy right here is checking the voltage. That plug is hooked up to a voltage power supply that puts out about 15 different voltages at different amplitudes and different frequencies. And that little box, if you had a meter, you can check everything. All those points were the different frequency. Now the hydraulics is off. You can see whenever you see the antenna droop, the hydraulics was off. Another commercial. We'll skip this. We're going to deal with this. Okay, back to the airplane. Now, that pod that you see in the center, that's the telemetry pod. That's talking to the ground. It's talking to the controllers. It's doing a lot, but it's recording all the angles of attitudes. And right here, the engineering team is going through all the testing that they're going to do. And I want to talk about one little thing that was down here in the bottom. Maybe he'll point to it, maybe we'll see it. Not, I guess not. But one of those squares said human factors. Okay? Human factors were being taught in 1967 by the Pentagon and the Navy. Human factors is mapping how humans react in certain situations. In every situation that arises in the cockpit, they try to map how a human's going to react to it over and over and over again. Now here you have a Sparrow hung on a wing pod. And like I said, this is all first-time stuff. Done for the first time. Procedures mapped out. They're writing the book on how to hang missiles. They watched the people do it, and they watched the mistakes, the challenges they have, doing it real time. And then once they document everything that's being done, and when it comes to writing a procedure book, they take all their notes, everything they've learned from this test, and apply it as procedure. And a year later, there's a manual for hanging the missile. There's a manual for doing this. There's a manual for doing that. And all that manual was derived from all this testing that was done at a very high level. All the prototyping for the test, the bit test, the byte test, everything was being done here by the engineers very, very early, before the plane ever hit the fleet. Now, when I say the different ways, this is a drone. That black object is a drone. And that drone has telemetry on it that's talking to the ground stations. The missiles they fire do not have explosives in them. What they have is targets, and when the missile is fired, if it gets close to the drone, it's scored as a hit without blowing up the drone. And replacing the warhead in the missile was a telemetry device that talked to these ground stations. Everything is being triangulated by those ground stations. They're watching everything. Now they come back, they take all the research, whether the missile worked, how did it work at firing up in an airplane? How did it work firing down at an airplane? How did it work when an airplane is flying in front of your nose from left to right? How did it work when an airplane in front of your nose is flying right to left? What if the airplane is going up? What if it's going down? All right, all of this is being plotted from the test. They have to know what the capability of the missile system is and the capability of the aircraft. McDonnell Douglas built this airplane. It was second generation. It wasn't a B model. It was a J model. It had upgraded engines, had upgraded avionics, and a lot of the parts, even though they were both Phantoms, were not interchangeable. And what happened was these F4Js that the Marine Corps got from the Navy very early on, a lot of them were at the limit of their life. The Marine Corps got F4s that had reached almost the limit of carrier landings. Every time this airplane makes a carrier landing, it's landing at like over 125 or 150 miles an hour, and it comes to a stop immediately with a tail hook. That stresses the airframe. Anybody that knows anything about the airframe, well, it puts stress on the keel of the airplane, what they call the keel. Here we go again. And after so many landings, everything is logged. They keep a log on everything the airplane does. Hell, here's a target where they're shooting down at a target. Okay, where he's looking down, shooting down. They're going to plot all this data, find out how the missile worked, how the airplane worked. What they're doing is proofing the capability of this airplane right now during all these tests. Now it's a look-down shot. To anybody who wants to get an understanding of the Marine Corps culture, flying F4, of course it was an F4B that was being flown in the movie, but anybody who ever saw the movie The Great Santini with Robert Duvall, he played a captain flying an F4B in Beaufort, South Carolina. And it's very typical of the Marine Corps Air Wing. All through that movie, Robert Duvall, as one of the hottest pilots they had on an F4, had nothing but disrespect for Navy brass. He was a cowboy. He was a hot shot. His poor family put up with his attitude. He was like, win at all cost. Okay? Well, that's what I lived. I was stationed in Beaufort. I had pilots that were just like the Great Santini. They could care less if I saluted them. All right? They weren't into military culture of saluting and all this Navy brass chicken shit. Those pilots understood that we, as Marine Corps mechanics, avionics people, anybody working on the plane, were disadvantaged by supply. The Navy got everything first. Like I said, the airplanes that we got, usually that made up the Marine Corps squadrons, were Navy planes that had exhausted the number of landings they could do on a carrier. Either that or they said, he's got 50 more landings. That's it. After 50 landings, they can't land on a carrier. We'll sell it to the Marine Corps, give it to the Marine Corps. After the Navy's been flying it for 2 or 3 years, the Marine Corps finally gets it in their inventory, and it comes with a host of problems. A logbook that weighs, if you took all the paper in the log for that airplane, the paper would weigh more than the airplane. That's how much history we had on it. But, like I said, I was required, while I was taking a 6-week course on this radar system, and that was my MOS. Another thing, we had 3 avionics shops in the Marine Corps, what they considered avionics. We had electric shop. Electric shop took care of all the electrical, mechanical stuff on the airplane. Anything that had a wire to it that was mechanically and controlled by electricity was done by electric shop. Now ComNav, anything that had to do with radios or navigation was done by ComNav shop. Because this radar was so sophisticated and it did so many things, we were always working on it. You're looking at what I looked at for 2 years, every night, going through bit test. When you did a bite test, there was like about 4 different bite tests you could do. You could do a quick pre-flight bite test. You could do a little more in-depth bite test. But when you were doing overhaul, real overhaul, and you wanted a thorough check, that bite test was about 350 pages long. It took a couple hours to do a complete rundown of that airplane, and it never, ever passed all the bites. He's replacing a line replaceable card. Okay? That card right there might have something to do with the display. It's a display generating card. I forget a lot of parts of it, but this was a bench. This is a bench set up in a lab, and whenever you sent a part that was suspected to be wrong, this bench was always up and maintained at 100% all the time by Navy technicians. So if you sent a part in, a scope, anything that was part of the radar system, and I think there was like 32, 35 line replaceable units that could be replaced. Whenever you suspected one was bad, they'd put it on this bench. They'd take their good part off the bench and they'd put what you suspected as a bad part on the bench. And this right here, every time, you see where it stopped like that? That's doing an individual test on an individual page in the bit box. Okay? And while I was in Japan, they had a special project for Westinghouse. Nixon was president. When I was in Japan, we had 2 squadrons of airplanes, about 20 each, side by side. One was 232. I was in 334. They were identical squadrons. They had just been pulled out of Vietnam. But now I'm going to turn on the volume and we'll play it over again. because, and I'll stay quiet, but let's see if I can get rid of this and start all over again. Here it is. Bada bing. There it is. And we'll turn on the sound so that you can hear.
Guided missile trials were divided generally into the categories of ground tests, captive flights, launch flights, serviceability, and human factors tests.
Human factors.
The following description of the program will be presented categorically rather than chronologically. Pit ejection tests of the Aero 7A launcher were conducted on stations 3, 4, 6, and 7 at the Naval Missile Center facility. An earlier attempt to eject at the Miramar Naval Air Station facility had shown the F4-J electrical connection to be incompatible with standard pit ejection wiring used on the F4B aircraft.
Like I said before.
The ejection test shown here in slow motion proved that the launchers operate properly and that the necessary voltages for motor fire were provided. In another series of tests, engineers set out to establish the areas potentially hazardous due to the radar microwave radiation.
I never mentioned that.
Power density and energy density values were measured at various distances between 10 and 175 feet from the aircraft.
They had to establish safe areas, safe zones.
For the investigation, 2 modes having the highest average power were used. These were pulse Doppler and pulse mode, operating at its maximum duty cycle. The measurements were made with the antenna in a fixed position and scanning in a 120-degree arc. Measurements indicated that the hazard area extended out to 175 feet in the PD mode. However, the F4J cockpit attenuates the PD signal by 5 dB, and therefore a safe in-flight distance of 22 feet between aircraft has been established for operating in the PD mode with the radar in search.
We ignored that.
To determine the compatibility of the aircraft,
that.
test support equipment, and guided missiles when handled by service personnel, 2 loading tests under 2 different conditions, stateside and simulated tropical, were conducted. In this way, a correlation of the crew's performance under widely different environments could be made. The first test was conducted on the parking strip under ambient temperature, both during daylight and night. Monitoring was done by serviceability inspectors and human factors engineering psychologists.
Human factors.
Timing of the task commenced when the crew approached within a wingtip distance of the aircraft and finished when the task was completed.
They were documenting every task so they could write
Missiles were
procedure.
loaded on stations 2, 3, 6, and 8, either manually or by using the Aero 64A or the Aero 52A missile loaders. The second test, simulating tropical conditions, began on the evening of 26 May when the aircraft was installed in the environmental chamber for the heat soak tests. After a 12-hour transition period, the temperature reached 150 degrees Fahrenheit with an 80% relative humidity. This condition was maintained for 24 hours. Then at 0500 28 May, the temperature was lowered to 90 degrees and the aircraft drenched with a 2-inch-per-hour rain for 2 hours. At the end of this period, the aircraft was examined for deficiencies and water intrusion. It was found that there was water in the APG-59 radome, on the UHF radio and the floor of the RIO cockpit, and on the engine master control panel in the pilot's cockpit. In addition, there was excessive water in the
guy in the
link
back
compartment.
with a speed
When the
handle
inspection
taking
had been
that
completed,
turtleback off.
the cockpits and compartments were resealed and a 1-inch-per-hour rain started. The temperature was 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity 80%. The missile loading crew performed this operation under day and night conditions as in the earlier test. First, an AIM-9B Sidewinder missile was loaded manually on the inboard wing station 8.
These people were ordnance.
Then a Sparrow 3 AIM-7 was installed on the inboard wing station 2.
Ordnance people were some of the craziest people in the Marine
For this
Air
operation,
Wing,
the Aero 64A hoist bar was used.
because they dealt with explosive all day long.
For the loading of the aft port station number 3, the Aero 52A hoist cart was employed.
I stayed completely away when they were hanging missiles or doing something like that, and it was ordnance.
The final
I
station
stayed
number
away.
6 was then loaded manually. The same ground rules regarding timing were employed as used in the stateside ambient condition test. Unloading of the missiles then was performed in the same order as the loading. After a rest break, the entire test was repeated under nighttime conditions. The aircraft was then returned to the hangar for a complete electrical checkout.
He's checking
This
every
checkout
voltage
revealed a
coming
number
out of that
deficiencies,
voltage packet.
including the APG-59 radar pulse Doppler and pulse displays seriously degraded, and numerous no-go indications from the test selector programmer, more commonly known as the built-in test or bit programmer. During the first flight, 31 hours after exposure, several other discrepancies were found.
Hey, you have an hour this week, right?
Yeah.
Great! I can teach you how to play 100 songs on piano in an hour. No way!
In the 3 months of the F4-J BIS guided missile trials at the Naval Missile Center, 64 flight tests were flown under a variety of operational conditions. To illustrate this phase of the program, a description of one of these flights will be presented. An operation actually begins several weeks or months before the flight with the preparation of a test plan, which is part of the overall program plan. Then, 2 weeks prior to the event, a scheduling meeting is held to inform all involved offices that the test, as well as other operations, is approaching. At this meeting, problems of coordination will be discussed and modification made to the schedule. Present are the representatives of the project office, serviceability, human factors, system evaluation division, air-to-air missile branch, and others. These offices, during the intervening time, will implement the test plan. Approximately 2 hours prior to takeoff time, the missiles are loaded. If the flight is to be a launch, the missiles will be loaded in the revetment area. Otherwise, the captive missiles can be installed at the hangar. As the operation time approaches, pre-flight checkout of the aircraft, the missile control system, and the instrumentation is made by service and contractor personnel. Meanwhile, a pre-flight briefing is underway to ensure that all personnel are familiar with the test plan for the day's operation. The test conductor conducts this briefing, reviewing such items as range time, takeoff time, altitude, target environment, angle of launch if applicable, speed, range, and target aspect.
I was familiar with all those terms.
Questions that may arise are also resolved and last-minute problems discussed.
We had to be, that was our language when we talked
At the
to each
scheduled
other.
time, the aircraft taxis out for takeoff, and the operation begins. The test plan now begins to unfold as the test conductor and others directly involved monitor and control the operation from the control center. Direct voice communication with the aircraft is maintained throughout the flight, while radar position plots of the target and interceptor are shown in real time. At the same time, in the data center, telemetry from the missile, along with all other information, including voice communication, is received and recorded. In any operation, data is critical, and so for the F4-J program, a combination of range and airborne instrumentation was used. Range instrumentation consisted of target control and target telemetry. radar tracking of the interceptor and the target, reception of telemetered information from the missile both before and after launch, and voice communication between control center and the pilot. On the F4-J, the tape recorder in the centerline pod recorded weapon system performance data and elapsed time. Tying all this data together was a range timing signal transmitted to the control center, telemetry stations, and the instrumentation pod of the aircraft. Later, after the operation has been completed and the data reduced, engineers and project personnel analyzed this wealth of information to locate system discrepancies and decide on possible improvements or corrections. This analysis may even show the need for additional operations to answer questions raised by the test. Another source of information was the debriefing session held immediately after the operation, in which the pilot and RIO present verbal reports and test engineers are able to question the operators.
We'll stop it here. When he says debriefing, that was my job. For about 1.5 to 2 years, my job was to debrief the pilots and RIO in a ready room whenever there was a discrepancy. If there was a discrepancy during the flight, and there always was, this radar very seldom ever worked 100%. So I knew all the pilots personally because I debriefed them. I debriefed the RIOs, and we didn't have a lot of military chicken shit to deal with, especially overseas. When I was in Iwakuni, these pilots considered us their lifeline. They didn't mess with us, okay? They tried to be as nice to us as we can because we're the guys that are maintaining that ejection seat. We're the guys that are maintaining the fuel pumps. We're the guys that are maintaining all this stuff for you. And especially when they got a radar person that they knew what was doing with the radar and could fix it, that was their eyes. I'll go on later. We'll let this go on, but I want to let you know that was my job, to debrief pilots. I knew them all.
The final product of the operation and the analyzed data is the deficiency report, which is reviewed by the Commander, Naval Missile Center. A breakdown of the captive flights conducted during the BIS trials shows the following types of operations and the number of runs in each. Look down, 43 runs. Low co-altitude, 74 runs, of which 25 were in the pulse mode and the remainder in pulse Doppler. Medium co-altitude, 30 runs, with 5 in pulse compression. High co-altitude, 20 runs, with 10 in each mode. In addition, there were 89 electronic countermeasure runs and 38 mutual interference tests. To evaluate missile control system and missile compatibility, 4 AIM-7E and 1 AIM-7D Sparrow 3 missiles with telemetry systems instead of warheads were launched during the BIS trials.
When you write, your tone influences how readers respond. With Grammarly, just highlight your text and type how you want to.
The first launch on 25 April 1967 was in a look-down, high-clutter environment against a closing BQM-34A target augmented to 4 square meters. The missile was an AIM-7E. The target was at an altitude of 200 feet and a speed of 0.62 Mach. At a range of 11 nautical miles, the pilot began to dive to a dive angle of 25 degrees and launched the missile in a head-on aspect at an altitude of 10,000 feet and a speed of 1.1 Mach, resulting in a closing velocity of 1,100 knots. Missile launch range was 6.8 nautical miles with a look-down angle of 12 degrees. The missile guided for 16.9 seconds to a missed distance of 3 feet. Missile control system and missile performance were both satisfactory.
I understood all that
a low
language.
co-altitude, high clutter environment against a closing target was used in the second launch on 2 May 1967. Again, the target was a BQM-34A augmented to 4.1 square meters, and the missile was an AIM-7E. Target and interceptor altitude was 300 feet with a target speed of 0.55 Mach and an aircraft speed of 0.44 Mach. The launch was made at 22 degrees off head-on with a right aspect angle and a launch range of 6 nautical miles. Closing velocity was 640 knots. The missile guided for 20.7 seconds to a 7-foot miss distance. Missile control system and missile performance were satisfactory. The third launch on May 4, 1967, presented the most exacting environment of the trials, with a look down into a high clutter against a closing target with a large aspect angle. An AIM-7D missile was used. The target, augmented to 3.8 square meters, was flown at an altitude of 2,900 feet and a speed of 0.53 Mach. The pilot pushed over at a range of 6.5 nautical miles to a descent of 30 degrees. Missile launch was made at a 62-degree right aspect angle at an altitude of 7,300 feet and a speed of 0.59 Mach, resulting in a closing velocity of 640 knots. Range was 2.2 nautical miles with a look-down angle of 16 degrees. The missile guided for 8.5 seconds to a direct hit and complete destruction of the target. The fourth launch, conducted on 9 May 1967, was designed to evaluate ripple firing 2 AIM-7E missiles in a high co-altitude, high closing velocity environment against an AQM-37A target augmented to 4 square meters. The missiles were launched in a head-on aspect at an altitude of 45,100 feet and a speed of 1.8 Mach, resulting in a closing velocity of 1,660 knots. The missiles were launched at ranges of 12.8 nautical miles and 11.4 nautical miles. The missiles guided to missed distances of 4.7 and 31.8 feet. In addition to the Sparrow launches, 3 non-instrumented Sidewinder AIM-9B missiles were also fired near the end of the trials. The purpose of these launch tests was to evaluate aircraft missile compatibility. All launches were satisfactory and resulted in direct hits on the Mark 24 flares used as targets. Serviceability and maintainability of the missile control system was monitored throughout the trials, with particular emphasis on the built-in test equipment, the ground maintenance equipment, and the AWM-21 maintenance bench. The bit is a semi-automatic test equipment which provides the RIO with a rapid means of determining the system's effectiveness. The functions programmed into bit permit the selection of a parameter, determination of whether it is acceptable, degraded, or unacceptable, and the reading out of the result. Bit was run periodically during flight and during ground maintenance. In the latter, the TS-2515 AWM-22 umbilical test set was used to simulate missile performance. In addition to monitoring regular maintenance, a detailed test of organization level...
I'm going to stop here just for a minute. I was responsible, our shop was responsible, 6238, AQ 6238 was responsible for everything on the airplane that went to the missile. Right there, that box right there is plugged up to an umbilical. It's a big plug attached to the missile. And that box will tell you if you've got everything at the missile that's supposed to be there. There's also a lanyard hookup on the saddle that the missile sits next to. And that saddle has two like shotgun shells that when you fire the missile, the shotgun shells go off and they drive the saddle down, an inverted saddle, and on that saddle, hooked to the missile, is a lanyard which is about a foot long. And when that lanyard was no longer connected to the missile, it had to give an indication that the missile, and that fired the missile. Once that lanyard got to the end of its limit and the missile was separated from it, the missile fired. And all this right here was pre what they called English bias. Whatever it told the missile where to look when it came off the plane. The computers had computed, you know, it's a look down or it's a look up, whatever. They computed and they preload the last thing that missile gets before it leaves the airplane is a head up where to look for the target and all that. And that was my job. It was my job to make sure there was voltage that would fire the shotgun shells. I had nothing. I didn't load them. They were a pyrotechnic. That was the ordnance loaded them. But I made sure that the firing voltage was there for the shotgun shells. I made sure that when I pulled down, we used to have to pull down the saddle to make sure that the cockpit knew that the not only did it fire the missile, but it let the cockpit know that the missile's gone. So you had to test that. And this had to pass the test. That was all 6238. Once we proved that that station was good to fire a missile, I walked away from it. I didn't want to be around it. I left these guys that were ordnance, and they all had a crazy smile on their face.
Maintenance was performed using standard
I
procedures.
hope I'm not
and
being
service
disrespectful, but anybody that knows that anybody...
Organization-level maintenance consisted primarily of substituting line-replaceable units called LRUs, which are designed to be interchangeable without tuning or adjustment. At the intermediate maintenance level, the AWM-21 maintenance bench was used to further test the LRUs through a series of fault isolation tests. The APG-59 radar installed on the bench is identical to that being carried in the aircraft, and thus it is possible to perform LRU checkout without aircraft downtime. A fault isolation meter used in conjunction with the bit isolates faulty subcomponents of the LRU and then, after repair, provides the means for retesting the unit. It was found during the trials that there were problems associated with the AWM-21 and built-in test equipment as a whole. The bit mechanization, as demonstrated in the BIS trials, both at the Naval Missile Center and at the Naval Air Test Center, was considered unacceptable by Navy standards. As a result of the BIS trials, the bit equipment will be extensively improved and will be satisfactorily demonstrated prior to Navy acceptance. On 21 June 1967, the F4-J BIS guided missile trials were completed. However, evaluation of the F4-J and the missile control system will be continued in the Navy technical evaluation at the Naval Missile Center. Follow-on testing will also be conducted at the Naval Air Test Center. These subsequent evaluations will be designed to test the modifications made as a result of the BIS trials and evaluate the missile control capability in even greater depth.
Now, we'll stop here, but I want to let you know, at the end of my 4-year enlistment, I was at the top of the game for that radar system. There was a very intense program just before I left Iwakuni. They took both squadrons, about 40 airplanes, and they brought in Westinghouse, all kinds of Westinghouse personnel, all kinds of tooling and equipment, And within 6 weeks, just about every airplane in both squadrons had an up airframe. That meant the plane will fly, and an up radar and missile system. You don't know how rare that was in Iwakuni to see every plane in the squadron with an up radar and an up missile system to go along with an up airframe. Every status board had 2 arrows at the top, 2 columns, one for the radar missile system and one for the airplane. And you could go there lots of times. Maybe they'd have a transmitter where they could see, but they couldn't fire a missile. Or they were in a degraded mode. There was always something in the avionics, and then there was a place to write next to the arrow what was wrong with the radar. And for the first 8 or 9 months, I got to the squadron just as it got pulled out of Vietnam. I had orders to go to the same squadron in Vietnam, but it took me about a month and a half to 2 months to get through all the training. I had to go through, I had to take a leave after I got the orders. I took about a 3-week leave. Then when I got back to Camp Pendleton, there was such a backlog of Marines going through Camp Pendleton that they put me on a special guard duty for a month. So there's a month, and then finally I get into training, and by the time that I got, and one thing I want to share this with you. I was stationed in El Toro, was just down the road or up the road from Camp Pendleton. So when all the training was done at Camp Pendleton, they more or less said, you're going to be dispatched and flown out of El Toro to Westpac. You're going to go eventually end up in Okinawa, and from there to Okinawa, you'll be assigned whatever area you're in. Because it had been about 2 months since or over 2 months, it had been about 2.5 to 3 months since my orders were cut to go from El Toro to Vietnam to be with this Vietnam squadron. During that Vietnam, or during that 3 months, the Marine Corps more or less got relieved from my Corps, and the Air Force and the Navy took over. So what happened was they pulled both squadrons out of Vietnam, and they thought whoever put them in there a few months early, 6 months earlier, or 8 months earlier, thought that the parts were interchangeable with F4Bs. So they flew the hell out of them as bomb platforms. They weren't really fighting air-to-air combat. They were used to haul bombs for close air support, and they flew them to death. They flew them to where they could hardly fly them because the parts supply wasn't there, and the Navy took over, the Air Force took over the air combat road. So they pulled them back out. They pulled them back out about a month before I hit Okinawa. And my last night, one of my last nights in America, after staging, is I went directly, me and a couple other guys that had been stationed in El Toro, we caught a ride and we got up to El Toro, and I wanted to say goodbye to all my friends that I had served with in El Toro. A lot of them I'd been to school with them in Memphis. I'd known them for almost a year or more, you know, friends. So I went in and I wanted to say goodbye to them, and while I was there, I was instructed and I was made knowledgeable that they were losing airmen or air wingers that were being sent to Vietnam against their orders. Because of the transition of pulling them back to Iwakuni, some of the orders hadn't caught up yet. And what they told me is, when you get to Okinawa, there's a good chance that they want to make you a 0311 and send you to Vietnam. And I want to let you know right now that in the last month and a half since they pulled the squadrons back to Iwakuni, we've lost a few air wingers because when they get to Okinawa, they send them to Vietnam as combat. Boots on the ground, 0311. And these guys doing what the Marine Corps tells them to do went. And now we're having trouble getting these trained that Uncle Sam has spent a lot of money to train to fix airplanes. We're having trouble getting them back out of Vietnam. So, when you get to Okinawa, don't let them send you to Vietnam. The planes aren't there. They're in Japan. So if anybody tries to send you to Vietnam, you tell them no. And by that time, I'd been in the Marine Corps almost 2 years. I was coming up on like 22 months in the Marine Corps. 22 months of nothing but mess duty, guard duty, shit duty, and dealing with real Marines. What happens is when they make a barracks sergeant for air wingers, they take somebody that's a combat Marine who's come back from Vietnam, and he doesn't understand the air wing culture. Okay? The air wing culture is we're prima donnas. Right? We don't shine our shoes. We don't polish our brass. We're like specs inside, a specialist inside the Marine Corps. And these people that come back from maybe Vietnam duty, who are straight away, squared away Marines that walked off a poster, they don't understand that we're technicians. And our pilots, when we're overseas, aren't really that big. But anyway, what happens? We land in Hawaii for a little bit to refuel, and we're off to Okinawa. We get to Okinawa, and we got off that plane about 10 in the morning, 9, 10 in the morning. And here's this fat slob staff sergeant Marine with two spare tires around his waist, grossly overweight for his position, with a cigar in his mouth, and he starts calling off names. And about 90% of the people, 95% of the people on that plane were all young, fresh-faced recruits. They just got out of boot camp. They went to ITR, went home on a leave, went through staging, and here they are. Fresh face. Haven't been in the Marine Corps much more than 6 months or 7 months. Okay? And they're all, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. They jump. When anybody with a higher rank tells them to do something, they jump. I was a little salty. I'd been in for like 22 months up to that point, and I had a little bit of an attitude. Plus, I had served in El Toro with guys that had just gotten back from Vietnam. These were guys that had been over in Chu Lai. They'd been rocketed. They'd worked in the heat of Vietnam. They were all F4B people, and they had an attitude. And the Marines in 1970 weren't running around going Semper Fi to each other all the time. They were saying gaff, give a fuck. That's what every one of those Marines that I knew came back from Vietnam that I served with in El Toro before I went overseas. Gaff was the mantra. Talk to any Marine. They didn't say Semper Fi. They were going gaff. Gaff. Okay? Well, anyway, I get off the plane in Okinawa after I've been given a lecture and told how it's going to work. I get off of it, and here's this fat slob staff sergeant, and he calls off my name, and I go, yo, here, Vietnam. Whoa. Whoa. The salt started coming out of my collar. Time out, Sergeant. And this guy tried to, he tried to intimidate me like he intimidated a boot. Marine, I said, get your ass over there. I go, whoa, dude, time out. You're not talking to a kid here. You're talking with somebody. I'm got a little more salt on his collar. Read the orders. And he started in again. I said, get over in the Vietnam line. You're being, let a real slave chaser. Well, finally, I kept saying no, read the orders. Well, it got to where it was heated enough that there was like a warrant officer in the area supervising. He was an observer, and he came over and more or less, are we having a problem here? And when the guy saw that the warrant officer was about to check his work, he finally said, go over to the Japan line. Go to the Iwakuni group. And I was one of the only ones assigned to Iwakuni because I was an air winger. Anybody get it? Well, that night, they put me in a transient barracks, but I was taught a lesson. Don't let people push you around, especially fat slob idiots. He had a cigar in his mouth. He was never going to see Vietnam again. Maybe he was there a couple of years before. He's out. They can't get rid of him. I was in, now, I'm in Beaufort. My last year, after all that training I had in overseas, it was intense. 7 days a week, 12 hours a day for 6 weeks. We worked on air radar. And when you see that antenna sweeping back and forth, when you have 4 airplanes nose to nose at a 90 degrees, they're all 90 degrees, and they're all nose to nose, and all those radar things are going like they are, it's hypnotizing. People start getting goofy watching these radar antennas, just sweeping back, going to all these different places. When I got back to Beaufort, South Carolina, for my last year in the service, I was pretty much way ahead of a lot of people in Beaufort, because Beaufort had been like a sideshow on the East Coast during Vietnam. There was guys that went directly from Memphis to Beaufort, and that's where they spent the rest of their time. I have a lot of survivor's guilt over how I got out of the Marine Corps without a scratch, and a lot of people didn't. But that survivor's guilt lasts about 2 seconds when I think of all the people that went to Cherry Point and Beaufort, and they never went overseas. A lot of them got married, they started families, things like that. And Beaufort wasn't a hot action place. It was a country club. There wasn't a lot of things going on the East Coast. And when I got there, I met so many people that I had been in Memphis with. And they never went overseas. I went to El Toro, and El Toro, most of the people that were in El Toro with me went overseas. And so when I got to Beaufort, I was pretty much up ahead of everybody else as far as technical stuff. I went through a crash course, cramming, like cramming in college. And when I got back there, the new people that were coming out of Memphis in my skill, in order to get my MOS 6238, they made these fellows sign up for 2 more years once they got out of basic avionics. when you got out of basic avionics now, it's either going to be ComNav, electric shop, or AQ 6238 on the F4-J. Okay? Because it was so deep and it was required so much technical skill that the Marine Corps decided, now that the war is slowing down, we're kind of out of the war, and we're going to make these people, before we send them to AQ, we're going to make them sign for another 2 years. So I got under the wire probably a year and a half early before they started making people sign for 2 more years. So I had a 4-year enlistment. It was on the way to ending. They were going to give me $15,000 to re-enlist in 1972 for 6 years, and I walked away. That little incident I had in Okinawa with that staff sergeant convinced me you can't trust the Marine Corps. If that warrant officer hadn't been there that day, I probably would have went to the brig in Okinawa. Because I stood up to him. I am not going to Vietnam. My orders are for Japan. And these were guys that the Marine Corps sometimes was losing 200 and 300 Marines a week. And this guy's job, he figured, was to get as many Marines on the ground in Vietnam as possible. We don't care what your MRS is. Okay, we need boots on the ground, bodies. Well, I stood up to him. I learned a very valuable lesson that day. Okay, but I'll stop there. This is quite long. If you're still with me, maybe there was 2 people out there who were 6238s, but I kissed the ground in Japan when I got there. To think that I came that close to being a name on the wall at the Vietnam Memorial, because I had very limited infantry training. I would have been a FNG wherever they sent me. And I would have had an attitude, I don't belong here. I'm supposed to be working on airplanes in Japan. All right? That's why I got out of the Marine Corps. But I want to add to you, anybody that was back there, I'm 75 right now, so anybody that's 70 or to 80 who was in naval aviation, that did what I did, 6238, maybe you were ordnance, you hung missiles, maybe you were electric shop, maybe you were ComNav, maybe you worked in the seat shop, you were an engine shop person, okay? And electric shop, one thing about electric shop, they were always running the engines, where I stayed away from all that. I was strictly a back seat, and whenever something didn't work in the pilot seat, I would work up there. Lots of times we had to replace the pilot's scope that he had. That was a lot of work. But during my last year and a half, and you all know, anybody that was back there in the Navy at the time doing what I was doing, anybody that was a Navy AQ on the F4-J, they were having people, they were having attrition problems in the Navy. Once these guys like me had the 4 years in the training, they left the Navy. They got sick of the chicken shit. So I'm going to remind you, does anybody remember Z-grams? Admiral Zumwalt came up with the Z-grams. The Z-grams more or less gave Navy personnel the permission to grow beards, to grow long hair. They could wear peepee glasses like granny glasses. The uniform was, everything was relaxed for all this Navy personnel that were doing carrier work. They were losing them. They were dropping like flies. People were like, I'm sick of it. I don't want to be in the Navy anymore. So Zumwalt, to stop the bleeding, to stop the attrition, the loss of technical skill at all these levels, came out with Z-grams, more or less told all the captains, all the officers, leave these people alone. If the guy wants to have long hair, leave him alone. If he wants to wear a beard, leave him alone. If he has wants to wear a uniform that's like 30 years out of date, right? Wants to wear headgear like an old flapper leather helmet, leave him alone. He's a radar technician. It's going to cost us a fortune. That's why they went to the 6-year enlistment. And like myself, when my 4 years was up, I got out. You're not going to kill me. You take that $15,000 and you keep it. All right? I don't need it. I'm going back to college, and that's exactly what I did. I don't regret one day walking away from the Marine Corps. It's like the Blue Lodge in the Masons. I was in the Blue Lodge, okay? I went into it. I stayed in it 4 years. I did my thing. I got out, and that's it. I went back to college. But anybody out here that might see this video, I'm kind of long-winded, but I spent my life in the back seat, and that all night long on every shift. I usually worked swing shift or graveyard. I didn't want to be around the brass during the day. And I've done that throughout my career. I do not like day shift. There's too much management. Okay? So I always worked in the evening, and every night we had a full schedule. And that when they pulled the radar out of the airplane, you had to have this special bar. You opened up the radar, you stuck the bar that it was built to hold the weight. It was special purpose. You stuck it in over the radome, and then over the radar, and then you could slide the radar out on the bar and have it exposed so you could get to it and work on it. And those hydraulic mules that you saw the line, the Marine Corps, the base I was at, and every Marine Corps station, we never had enough equipment. We were lucky to have maybe 2 bars in the squadron. We were lucky to have a hydraulic mule that worked. We were lucky to have an electrical unit to power the airplane. We didn't have any remote electricity out on the line. Everything had to be a power unit. And so many nights we would do a test. We'd open up the radar, put the bar in, pull the radar out, do the test, figure out what component we think was wrong, remove the component, order a new one, put the radar back in, close the radome, take the bar out, because we got another airplane next to it, and we don't have a hydraulic mule for another one. We don't have electrical. So we put everything away, and now we move the electrical equipment and the hydraulic mule and the bar over to another one. And all, like I said, all these ladders that you see the Navy, everybody's climbing up on a ladder. I didn't see one ladder the whole time I was in the Marine Corps, anywhere. For pilots or mechanics, there was a little button. You pushed the button and this 2-piece ladder dropped down, and you had to shimmy up the plane on that. But I'm hoping maybe somebody out there sees this that did this for a living. When I tell people I've forgotten more than you know, that's what I'm talking about, technically. And this training got me a job with a commuter airline in upstate New York. I started cutting my teeth there. I had to learn A&P work. Avionics was no problem. I had avionics. I can read diagrams, okay? And I can troubleshoot anything that's electromechanical. But when it came to airframes, power plant, prop governors, things like that, fire detection for the engine, all that stuff, I had to learn that. But the avionics part, I had it. And when I left United Airlines, I was CAT qualified. If any pilots out there, I was CAT qualified on everything United had. That meant the old 747s, the new 747-400, the 777, the 727, the 757, the 737, the DC-10. I was CAT qualified. I had been sent to school for the avionics portion of that airplane, each of those airplanes, and then I went to autopilot school for about 2 weeks on every one of those fleets, and then I was given certification to sign off CAT, the auto land. And when I got to US Air, I had the same capabilities with US Air. I had certification to sign off the auto land. Only a very tiny percentage of the mechanics at United or US Air had certification to sign off the CAT qualification, the auto land, the autopilot. Now, I hope people that have worked in as a 6238, maybe somebody will recognize me out there, but I was stationed in El Toro when they had Bs. It was VMFAT 101, and they sent it to Yuma. It was moved from El Toro to Yuma. I was in 334 in Iwakuni. I think it was 232 or 332, one or the other, was our sister squadron in Iwakuni. And then when I got back to the States, my last duty was VMFA 251 in Beaufort. And during that time, we did deployment to Key West, Florida, deployment to Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico, and I was sent to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, requested by the pilot. Our avionics, our officer who was in charge of the avionics shop, they hustled up a whole bunch of airplanes and they sent them to Cuba because they were having trouble with Castro pirating ships. So I worked about one or two nights helping, doing all these checks on missile stations, things that were never ever done in Beaufort. Prior to me getting there, because there were no problems. But when I got there, they started having trouble with Castro, and they started these missile deployments, hot pad duty in Key West, Roosevelt Roads missile shoot, and then me and one other volunteer Marine were assigned to go to Guantanamo. I got back to the shop after 2 nights of helping them get everything up. These missile tests, the box, all that stuff. Nobody had ever done it before. We got everything up, ready to hang missiles on it. And when they flew those planes to Guantanamo, our shop Lieutenant Evans, went with it. He was the first one. Him and his pilot were the hottest pilots in the group, in our squadron. And he and a sergeant, a staff sergeant, went with him. And the first thing they requested is, we want Mr. Lasham. So I was living off base. I got back to work like the third morning after 2 days of intense getting these planes, doing everything I can all night to train the new people, teach them how to do it, get it done. I get back there on the third morning, and they said, Go home, pack your sea bag. You're going to Guantanamo. I said, who else is going? They said, you and whoever wants to volunteer. But you. They've requested you. Lieutenant Evans wants you. Sergeant Ross wants you. They don't want anybody else. Plus, you're single. You don't have any wife and kids here like everybody else in the shop. Why should we send a guy with a wife and kids there when we can send you? Plus, they want you. Okay? So, there's a lot more to the story, but I'll stop here. After that, after doing all that, I got passed up for sergeant, and they gave it to a good old boy from down south that had a wife and kids. They figured no matter what you know, we don't care. He's been with us for the last 2.5 years. The CO knows his wife. All the head people in the squadron, when they have a company picnic, they know his wife and kids. You're not getting sergeant. We're giving it to him. Well, that's one of the reasons I left. About 2 months later, Lieutenant Evans, just before I was about to get out, came up and he had to give me the re-up lecture. I said, don't even start. Don't even bother starting. Where do I sign? He goes, you're giving up 15. I don't care. I'm out of here. Give me, I signed it. I'm out of here. Thank you. Okay. I left the Blue Lodge, what I considered the Marine Corps Blue Lodge. I went in there just as a Marine. I had no intention of making a career out of it, because I would have been an alcoholic. One thing you have to do in the Marine Corps is drink. And at that time, people were having problems with marijuana infiltrating the Marine Corps, and you had to prove that you weren't a hophead by drinking like a fish. I left it. Anyway, thank you for listening.